Hi, this is Matt Finch, and this is Uncle Matt's D&D neighborhood. And today, my guest is Edwin Nagy. Say hello.
Hello.
Edwin is one of those people who does all kinds of stuff. You have probably seen a lot of his work, but don't know who he is. And I love to go out and talk to the people who do a lot of the work behind the scenes, both in the gaming community at large and also in terms of publication. And Edwin does a lot of conversion from older editions to fifth edition, and from fifth edition to older editions of D&D. And that, I think, is what we want to start focusing on, Edwin. So
Sure.
let me let you just sort of start, riff on that topic and tell us what things you think are the most important. What are the big broad brushstroke issues with the conversions?
Um, yeah. Big broad. I guess the interesting thing, the biggest interesting thing to me is, generally speaking, the author has either a story or a mood or a um, style and experience that they're going for when they create the original adventure, and typically that style or mood is related to the rule set that they're writing for. So somebody writing in Pathfinder is likely to have a different table experience in mind than somebody who's writing in Swords and Wizardry. Somebody who's writing in Call of Cthulhu has another experience in mind from somebody who's doing some kind of PBTA um, game. And so one of the things that is interesting to me is how to make the translation from one rule set to another, honoring both the author's intent, if I can figure it out, of what the experience is, and honoring the expectations of the people who are playing the other game. And obviously, if they're close to each other, so if it's Swords and Wizardry to first edition D&D, you know, the
Yeah,
intent and the
that's
expectation of, yeah, right. There's no real breakthrough there. But if you're going from Pathfinder to Swords and Wizardry, or fifth edition to Swords and Wizardry, those are still reasonably close. They're all in the kind of D&D world. I haven't actually done a say D&D to Call of Cthulhu, although I've thought about some of those and how some of that might work. I've been in games that have switched. I'm sure all of us have been in games that have switched from one rule set to another. I was in one that went from Pendragon to GURPS, and so those sorts of things
that's
get to be a
that's a
little bit.
that's a leap. Yeah.
That was a leap, right? So there, it's harder to honor both sides of where you're going and where you're coming from. Um, and then it really comes down also, I guess, as a lot of the gaming stuff does, to the style of gaming. And that's obviously hard to do. That's one of the, I think, big challenges just behind publishing in general, is that if you're running a game for your table, you kind of know what they like and you do that. But if you're publishing a game, you want to give a little bit for everybody, or maybe you don't. Maybe you want to say, this is my niche, this is what I publish in. And so again, doing the rules translation to match that idea, whatever it is tough and fun.
And so let me jump in there. I mean, I think it's probably immediately clear to people watching that you've got a couple layers of conversion. I mean, there are a lot of people who just go in and they, change some numbers around and go with it. But when you hit another level of it, especially when you're publishing, there's considerable artistry involved in the conversion process. The converter is side by side with the author when you are going to that second version of something. It's not the system where it was originally done. And
Right,
so just to
right.
mention to people that, this is by no means talking about numerical conversions. There is a huge amount of decision making that needs to be done by the converter. So it's almost like, when you see translations of books and the translator gets almost equal billing with the author. That's
Right.
really the way things ought to go. They don't really. I mean, people don't credit the converters with as much as is involved. But the couple of things that you've just said, I think make it clear there are a lot of decisions to be made.
Definitely. And it's yeah, and actually, I mean, so part of my RPG ethos, I guess, is that I let the GM worry about a lot of stuff in terms of balance, and I let the players worry about a lot of stuff in terms of balance, meaning, encounters are too hard, too many, too easy, too much XP, too little gold, whatever it is. So a lot of the things that I think most people spend most of their time worrying about for translation, I actually spend less time than I ought to worrying about, probably, because in my mind, most of those things are stuff that happens at the table for an individual group and happens differently for each group. Now, that said, and this sort of shows that I am not, for example, a 3-5 Pathfinder GM, writer, player. I've played a bunch of it, and I've enjoyed it, but it's not where my heart is, and I don't know those rules well enough. I know that people who play Pathfinder in general expect to have the math work out, and I think people who are Pathfinder aficionados expect to have the math work out when they play other games also.
Yeah, I think that, one thing about Pathfinder, in terms of looking at it as a market, from a publisher's standpoint, and the question of what are people buying, a lot of what people are buying in Pathfinder, and I think it was true of 3rd edition too, is they were buying the stats package, right, because so that they didn't have to spend the time making things consistent, and therefore the internal consistency and the adhesion to the rules was all very important with those. Whereas in both original D&D Swords and Wizardry and also in 5th edition, that that precise numerical consistency is less important to the people who are purchasing those products. What they're looking for is something different.
Yeah, and and I think 4th edition is sort of more on the Pathfinder side again of being important to get the math right. And I don't translate to any of those because I don't know them well enough. I'm happy to translate from them because I know them well enough to know sort of what the goal was then. One of the things I was thinking about recently, which is sort of interesting, is in the 0 edition and 1st edition adventures, we are very used to seeing 12 orcs with 12 different sets of hit points, right? The author rolls or whatever, you get a list of hit points.
Yes.
Super fine grained, super detailed, as if those are somehow interesting differences, and I think they are. I mean, there's some interesting, if you hit one orc and it goes down and on a dagger hit, and the other one you have a couple blows of the axe and it's still up.
Well, it can give you some tactical variation. One of the orcs is a lot bigger than the other, stuff like that.
Right, yeah, there's something fun there. And then in the thing I'm working on right now has a lot of detailed differences in terms of, here is an NPC who's basically a 5th level fighter with 60 hit points, and here's a different NPC who's basically a 6th level fighter with 55 hit points. Now, in 5th edition, those are the same creature, generally speaking, and really a 7th level fighter, an 8th level fighter, you're starting to see maybe there's a difference between 5th and 8th, but it's a little too fine grained. So it's interesting that the 0 edition stuff has its style of fine grain, and the 3.5 Pathfinder has its style of fine grain, and then 5th edition almost kind of blurs both of those out. Where
it does. It's abstracted out a lot of the specific numbers, and it's played. Well, you talk about how it's played. What is the effect of that difference? That, for example, in 5th edition, almost always you're just using average hit points for something rather than rolling. How is that fine grain different in 5th edition, or how is it absent, and what does that do?
I mean, I think its intent is to sort of simplify the GM's job at the table and to take away some of the swinginess, I guess, in some sense. Meaning that, if one of your orcs has 3 hit points and one has 8 hit points, and you're a 1st level character, that's a huge difference. Whereas if you know that an orc is going to have 7 hit points, that allows you to, as a player, to have more confidence in your tactics, if tactics are what you decide to do, or more confidence in your decision about, I'm going to run away, I'm going to fight. So I think it changes the focus of gameplay a little bit by taking away that swinginess. And I think a lot of what 5th edition has tried to do in relationship to some of the old school stuff, fourth edition did it as well, is take away the swinginess. But they're sort of bringing back the abstractness. So fourth edition was not swingy. Like, I think you sort of knew if this encounter, if you were good at fourth edition, you knew if you could win this encounter or not. Like, you know, when the GM laid it out, you could get out your Magic 4E calculator and say, yeah, we're going to win this, or you know, we have a 98% chance of winning this combat. In fifth edition, there's, I think you can, you can't quite do that, but it's more on that side. But on the other hand, there's not that level of tactics in order to win. Like in fourth edition Pathfinder, you really need to play your stuff right. So it's I don't know, it's fuzzy, I guess, but there's some definite differences.
I think if you look at something that, you know, a lot of people call granularity, you know, granularity being sort of an atomic unit of a rule, and the and how a numerical rule comes into play as opposed to a made up general tactic, like I'm going to jump up on the table and swing from the chandelier and do stuff like that, where there's not a defined thing. I think you do see the granularity in different places, because I had a really interesting conversation with Jonathan Pickens about theater of the mind, and he was talking about a difference between older systems and newer systems, in that having to do with the length of the round. That if you have a minute-long round, that makes it much easier for people to do the jump on the table, swing on from the chandelier, stuff like that. A sort of, you know, almost a sequence of ideas that comes in that's not granular. Whereas in a 6-second round, and in general, I think in newer design games, you have granularity. It's not so much to do with precise numbers, at least in fifth edition. It sort of was in third, but in fifth edition, it doesn't have so much to do with precise numbers, but the round is broken up into actions, so that the actions become the important granular pieces of things. And he was like, I don't like that. Other people may like it a lot, but it's that feeling of time limitation. There are only a couple things that you can do. You've got slots in which you can do them, and in what way do you play those chess pieces in any given round? I mean, how do you think that plays out in terms of what we're talking about?
It comes out especially in places where the author has, for example, given NPC tactics, or has some complicated traps or sort of moving dungeon pieces, where if the author has a 1-minute round in mind, when they're saying, okay, so on the first round this happens, or it takes 3 minutes for this to happen, you know, for this well is going to fill up. It's going to take 5 minutes for this well to fill up, and after that happens, blah blah blah. There's a huge difference between those 5 minutes being 5 rounds of action versus 50 rounds of action. And what can happen, because really, you know, in any of these games, 10 rounds is a lot. Like, you can do a lot in 10 rounds. But in first edition, that's 10 minutes, and in fifth edition, that's 1 minute. And so the difference between
the stuff that's
non-combat stuff,
in the outside world, as opposed to the inside world, you know, of the rules-oriented combat. You know, it takes it's only realistic to have a giant basin fill with water at a particular speed, and so
exactly, yeah. So how do you match the excitement, the authorial intent of having this take 6 rounds of combat versus the authorial attempt of making this realistic? This takes 6 minutes to fill. With, boy, if you give a 5e player 6 minutes, you know, the whole dungeon's going to be cleaned out.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so that time thing. One of the things I was just thinking about, Ken Hite has a new Yellow King role-playing game. I haven't read yet, but I think he has basically taken combat to 1 round of actions, because so it's taking that 1 minute and just like, even just let's just abstract combat, and because that's not the focus of that rule set, right? There's other things that are focused. So I was sort of thinking about that I think a lot of us who play D&D style games, one of the things we enjoy is combat. Although I've met a lot of D&D players who actually don't enjoy combat very much. But it's always been a focus of the rules.
Sure, absolutely.
And so it's interesting though, thinking about where you put that needle in terms of abstracting. Because when I've occasionally run really big things,
you can look over to, you know, an area much more extreme in terms of that, you know, with things like, you know, is it RuneQuest? Oh shit, I'm forgetting the name of the game.
That is a game.
Okay, yeah, maybe it's RuneQuest, but maybe it's Rollmaster. It could be either way. But anyway, there are systems that are unbelievably complex in terms of effect of a halberd hitting as opposed to a dagger hitting. You know, you're going to bleed
at a time also, right? There's ones that, if we're just, you know, sticking even just to time, there's ones where it's like, okay, we're going to do a parry riposte, you know, attack parry, you know, we're going to bring all this real meticulous. And I was thinking on a big battle scale, like, I don't have the patience to run a war game in my RPG. So if my story that, you know, if the story that's happening at the table turns into a battle with 200 whatevers, boy, that's going to become like 3 rounds of some kind of like, yeah, roll me a D6 or something. As opposed to, you know, it could easily turn into a super fun 4-hour game of its, you know, of its own thing with a mass combat game.
Yeah, a game within a game.
Right. Yeah. And then and that was another thing. So circling back to translation, one of the things that's also fascinating is that Zero Edition authors generally put systems into their games. So I'm writing a module and I have something that comes up, some underwater combat where there's a gate that has to get broken open. I'm going to add a mechanic because I know that whatever rule set I'm writing for doesn't have the mechanic built in. So I'm going to make something up based on D6s or percentiles or whatever, and I'm going to write that into the adventure.
Right. You give people the house rules because there weren't rules for
this thing. And so one of the jobs for me as translator is to say, okay, the author made these house rules to provide this experience with this level of sort of suspense and probable success, but 5e or whatever actually has rules for all of these things. You know, I can do these appropriate skill checks. It has stuff for being underwater, for underwater combat. So how can I bring in the existing rules, because there's no sense making up a new mechanic if there's, you know, if you already have something.
And that pisses people off too in a published product.
Right, because then you have conflicting. Right, now we have 2 rules that don't match for the same activity, or it was also for magic items. And then how do you keep the same excitement of the story? Or maybe you can't. You know, sometimes, so Quicksand has one thing here and something there. And I know one of the things that people have complained about a lot is the idea of concentration. So in 5th edition, a lot of the spells require concentration, which means you can only have one of those spells going at a time, which means you can't pile on flying, invisibility, and haste, right? So that really changes your that really changes the story, because if your story relies on the big bad doing these things, okay, well, I want the big bad to do them, but we can't do them with spells. So now I'm going to give the big bad some other way of flying invisibly at double speed, because that's important to the excitement of the combat. But I can't just say, well, they cast these 3 spells.
Right.
So it's saying, do I want to keep the mechanic the same, or do I want to keep the story the same, or do I want to keep the threat level the same? You can't really keep everything the same. It's sort of like when you're doing modeling. You can keep the volume proportional, or you can keep the some angles proportional, or you can, you know, like you can't do everything,
right?
And you have to choose what's important. So the world map's a good example, right? Do we want my flat world map to keep distances consistent, areas consistent, or shapes consistent?
Right.
So
now the question is, let's get a little more detailed on that process, because I think that's one of the most difficult conversion tasks, is handling, because in 5th edition you get mini games as well. It's just that they're written for 5th edition rules, and in older edition rules you get mini games, and those tend to invent their own rules because you're usually working with a much lighter rule set. Now, so you're faced with a situation. Let's do an older edition to 5th edition because that's probably harder. You're faced with the underwater situation in which the original author has basically just said, this is what's going to happen at a certain time. And so people are going to drown after such and such if they can't successfully do such and such. And here's how it's done. And so they've constructed within the module this little bubble of events where there are optimal decisions, there are risks, there are rewards. All of that is sort of bubbled in there by the author using one rule set. Now you've got to do that same thing in the 5th edition rule set. What's the first thing you look at if you're faced with one of those little situation bubbles? What's the first thing you look at? Is it the story? Is it the experience? Is it the sequence of events that were in mind? I mean, how do you approach?
I think normally what I do is I would start with I would try to start with the most literal translation. So sort of going back to language, right? This is sticking your word by word into Google Translate and seeing what comes out.
Which we all know how that works.
Which is typically garbage. But I typically start with that. And then I'm going to go back and look at the original version and try to figure out what seems most important to the author. And if I have the author available, that's even better. I can send them a note and say, hey, in this sequence, is it really important for you that the bad guy shows up and disappears to be seen later? Or is it really important that the characters almost die? Or is it really important that the characters get this magic item? You know, what's your goal here? And then I can try to...
Which I can tell you from the standpoint of an author is usually I have no idea.
I have no idea. Yep.
I pictured that in one unit, and then I wrote what I wanted for that one unit. So
right, exactly. Yes. And I may go back. So rather than saying what's most important to you, I might go back and say, hey, I can do A or B primary, and then B or A secondary. Which, you know, those are now your choices.
Right. That's a lot easier. That's a lot better for authors.
Right. So depending on who I'm working with.
This is important because you're doing some of these conversions on stuff I've written. So I prefer two very simple choices: is it A or B? That's a lot better for me. And when you come back to me.
All right. Well, I'll keep that in mind. Yeah, and then.
Or alternatively, just ask Zach to make the decision. That's probably even better. Everybody always just turns to Zach when they've got something that they want to dump.
Well, and most of the time, of course, I just make the decision. Like most of the time, I just...
That's your job, yeah.
Right. A is the way I want to go, and I think it's going to be fun. I think this is what the 5e audience is expecting. I think they will enjoy this, and I think it keeps this overall story going. So then what I'll do is I will...
Oh, can I tell you a funny story?
Yes.
Talk about conversion. Back in the days, when Pathfinder was the big, and we were working between Swords and Wizardry, which obviously is original D&D, and Pathfinder, which of course, as you've pointed out, is a huge jump. Bill Webb had written an adventure where this happened and that happened, and Greg took it, and he had the issue of constructing it so that it would work in Pathfinder. And Bill got it back, and I got a phone call from Bill where he's like, Greg put a triceratops in my model, in my module.
So I haven't done that yet, but
next time, awesome. Next time that you are translating something that Bill did, what you should do, just put in a little section, that's a fake section that's got a triceratops in it. You should totally do that and send it to him.
A little sidebar. All right.
If you choose to add a triceratops to this encounter, here's
what you should do.
Yeah. Oh my God, we should do that for all of our stuff.
I think every adventure from here on out.
Yeah, every book. If you choose to add a Triceratops, here's what you do. If you choose to add a Triceratops, here you do it. People are going to think that we're like selling Triceratops.
Well, that would be the next thing, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
It would be the Kickstarter for Triceratops. You know, a 500-page book on the ecology and the history, the rules, the.
Yeah, and next time we work with Reaper Miniatures, and we could just tell them, yeah, we're gonna sell Triceratops miniature along with all the adventures, because every single one of them has advice on what to do if you have to add a Triceratops.
Magic items to make from the horn. I mean, we got it all there.
Yeah. Spells that affect Triceratops in a different way.
Right. Well, I look forward to the Triceratops Shaman. I mean, that's going to be a new class, playable class, obviously.
Yeah.
Class is great. I mean, it's going to be sort of a zero-y kind of thing.
Yeah, but it can't use hands because we've got our Triceratops miniature, and it's just a regular Triceratops. So.
That's right. But it has a magic wand. So that's
sure. Yeah.
Wow.
So yes. Did I derail you with that?
That was good. That was good.
To sort of do a derailing with
I think
my wonderful ideas.
I think I was just kind of talking in circles though around your question, which is basically then go back and try to make it an interesting encounter with rules that work. So I normally focus more on the series of events and story stuff, and I let the difficulty float a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so I might come up with something. So in 5e, for example, you can't drown. I mean, you can, but it takes a really long time.
Yeah, no, dying in 5th edition is a very difficult thing to do.
Well, and specifically drowning is difficult. And so, I mean, you have anyway. So I might either add something to the mechanic, which would be framed in 5e of, so maybe there's a little bit of electricity going through the water, or maybe there's something else going on that brings in the threat that is no longer there because you can't really drown in. I mean, you can, but because drowning is different in 5e than it is in Swords and Wizardry.
And one thing to say, and the benefit of 5th edition is that although they have produced a crunchier rule set than the older versions, or crunch is different, you do have a lot of potential methods for adding to a risk because risk is identified in probably more ways in 5th edition than it is in the other ones. So for example, you've got advantage, disadvantage. You could throw a bonus, which is not really traditional in 5th edition, but you could throw a bonus if you wanted to really fine tune something. You've got the fact that there are checks that you could make people do. And then you've got the vehicle of the saving throw if you want to manipulate the way the risk. So there are probably more vehicles for toggling something like that than there are in the older editions, interestingly enough.
Yeah, no, that's true. And I think one of the things I've enjoyed also is that there are also different types of threats. So one of the things that I like to use when somebody's pushing the envelope in terms of how we're going to damage characters in one rule set, one of the things I like to bring in is exhaustion as a 5th edition mechanic.
Yes, that's a good one. Although, are a lot of people familiar with that exhaustion rule? Because it's a good one, I think.
It's a good one.
What it is for anybody who's watching and doesn't remember it is that there are levels of exhaustion in 5th edition, and each level of exhaustion can have a result, and there are ways to move progressively toward more and more exhaustion. And so,
and death.
Yeah, that's the last
step of exhaustion, right? That's when you're, which is cool that it's part of the rule set. I lost us again, but bringing in. Maybe you were going to remind me.
What we were talking about was that you were talking about one of the tools for doing the conversion when you've got one of those situational bubbles is the ability to add an additional threat to the existing 5th edition rules that would normally make something a lot less lethal or move too quickly for the environmental surroundings.
Right. And and one of the things that I also have to keep in my head, which is in fifth edition is things like, so advantage disadvantage is very different from a bonus, because the advantage disadvantage is pretty easy to cancel out and never stacks, right? So you can't have double advantage, and even if you have 5 advantages and 1 disadvantage, you're just at neutral. And so there's a big difference between giving somebody a +2, which stacks with anything else in fifth edition. Like in Pathfinder, the different pluses, some stack, some don't, and they have
but everything is ultimately a plus,
right,
on a bonus.
Whereas advantage doesn't stack and it's pretty easy to come by. And so the difference between those is sort of neat, I guess, in some ways. And I throw a lot of advantage disadvantage in the translation because it's easy for the GM, but I have to always keep in mind that disadvantage is not very strong, because it's relatively easy for a creative player to come up with an advantage to cancel it out. Whereas if they have a -2 on their dex checks for the next hour, they've got -2 on their dex checks for the next hour, and there's nothing they're going to do about it.
And that is one of the significant differences, I think, where you actually find a major obstacle to translating the freeform older edition stuff into fifth edition. The reason being that in the older editions, generally you're trying to get as many advantages as you can. You know, I want to be on high ground, and I want to have cover, and I want to do this, and I want to do that. And those would, just in a common sense approach, stack.
Right.
Or they might be, the one player, one character, is positioned in a way that they have one advantage, and another one is positioned somewhere else where they have a different type of advantage. And that is one area where fifth edition has abstracted out in a way that I'm not sure that I like. I mean, when I do that, I use bonuses. It's basically like, advantage, disadvantage, it's about the same. You've got an ambush, but you're up here, so you've got a plus maybe on your to hit roll, and you're here, so you've got a plus on the damage roll. And I realize from the fifth edition design standpoint, that's a little bit clumsy, but it gets me to where I want to be in terms of the effect. Different players have different advantages. You're rewarded for your idea, of going up and hiding behind that rock, or getting the high ground, or something like that. And that is much more difficult to express. I mean, both at the game table and as a publisher, something like that, when things are filed down all the way to there's simply one side has advantage, one side has disadvantage, or one person has advantage and another has disadvantage.
Well, and I think it's related also to I think one of the 5e design goals of making this flatter curve, that the weapons only go up to +3, right?
Right.
And a +3, and things like the Frost brand, or the, some of the named weapons have, if they have something else going on, they don't have a plus to hit. And so, maybe they have +1d6 frost damage or fire damage or whatever it is, but they're not also +2 to hit. And so everything gets really compacted, and especially when you compare something like Pathfinder 3.5, where and 4e, where the bonuses can go up to, +20, +25 at really high levels. And we're trying to put all of that into a 5e curve where your pluses go up to 10 at, for some crazy stuff in terms of skill checks and attack bonuses and so forth. And then
which is a bit, I mean, and I do love that aspect of it, because it's like the people calling Pathfinder Mathfinder,
right.
when they do it, is that it is easier and faster the less arithmetic that you have to do.
Right, but I think it comes down to the same thing, though. If you want to give somebody a bonus for high ground and for having the sun behind their back and for surprise, well, the minimum bonus you're going to give is probably +3 at that point, because you say, well, they have sort of 3 things going for them, and I want to be different from this other character that only has 2 of those things going for them. But +3 is it's a big deal in Swords and Wizardry also. It's a huge deal, in fact.
Yeah, because the curves do tend to be the same, but it's by it's just that's a coincidence that they tend to be about the same.
Yeah, so it's interesting that so giving +3 on top of possible advantage is a pretty big deal. That's the equivalent of the character being 8 levels higher in terms of their proficiency bonus or something.
Right.
Or significantly, stronger, dexier. And so it's how those things all sort of balance out. And as I said earlier, you know, this is probably the dirty secret, but I tend to ignore a lot of that. Like I do it so it feels right, but I'm not in general going into the deep nitty gritty of seeing if it's balanced at the same point where it would have been balanced in the other game. I try to focus on the other piece. So for you, it's important to differentiate, right? That's one level of granularity that you like, and so I would try to respect that if I could, without really going crazy in terms of breaking the rules. But
what you're saying, I mean, because going right back to the beginning of the interview when you were saying that rules inform, you know, or guide the target experience, what you do is you look at the target experience first. And so
yes.
the granular bits and pieces that I've used in one system may not be the appropriate granular bits and pieces for the other system if what you are trying to do is to replicate again the sort of rules within the situational bubble that's taking place.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's also some sort of averaging out that happens. So this particular encounter, you as the author may not really like the way it turns out in 5e, but maybe this other encounter that was sort of an encounter in Swords and Wizardry is really cool in 5e. And so there's some of that goes on too. And I think the same thing with difficulty and with power of magic items is that some things go one way and some things go the other way. And so the overall experience hopefully is still fun.
Well, yeah, and that's so true, because in you know, I wrote the Mouth of Doom entrance to Rapanathik, which is becoming really, really popular because it's the first, you know, that's where you can start without instantly dying. But the 5th edition translation, there were a lot of reactions where people were like, you know, this particular thing was really, really cool. Now, I did not check the 5th edition translation of that. And so I was like, really? You know, because a lot of the stuff that, you know, the way that a lot of it shook out did exactly what you said. Some of the things that were in there turned out to be really interesting in 5th edition, whereas they were simply, you know, a speed bump along the way in the way that I'd written it to weaken you or alter your abilities before you hit some other particular thing, you know, that to me was going to be the super awesome thing.
Right.
So that was very interesting to see. A great example of, you know, just as you were saying, that the rules inform the structure.
One, just so I don't completely make people nervous, but one area where I do actually get back into the nitty gritty is after I've done all the monkeying with a creature, I do go in and try to attempt to calculate the CR. So I have a pretty ugly spreadsheet to work through, but I almost never do it in reverse. So when we see what's important for me is giving useful and coherent information to make it easy to run, rather than trying to match exactly what was going on. So if we're taking a creature and converting it to another edition, I will do the conversion sort of based on story and effect and all of that, and then I will calculate the CR correctly, hopefully. But I tend not to say, okay, this is a creature that would be a difficult encounter in Swords and Wizardry for a party of 5 second level, blah, blah, blah. And therefore, I also want to make it a difficult encounter. I'm going to say, well, this is what the creature does, and this is its challenge rating, and maybe that's easy in 5th edition, maybe that's hard in 5th edition, but this is what you run into. Because it really, I generally honor the story and the plot more than the mechanics in that sense. So if the GM wants to double the number of creatures because they see this as an easy encounter, you know, that's obviously, and they see that their party has just had a long rest and has some extra magic items, and you know, that's why I think it's more of a table by table experience. Whereas if they can get the story clearly and get the mechanics cleanly so they can do things quickly and efficiently at the table, then I feel like I've done my job.
And it's probably more important for them too to be able to look at the CR of something than it is to sort of not have a good idea of the CR, because that's a relatively important thing in 5th edition. And it's also easier. I think you get a much more accurate result if you do it the direction that you're talking about. And for anyone who's not familiar with 5th edition rules, monster creation and calculating the challenge rating, you can do it in two directions. You can start with a target CR, or you can just put in the stuff, and then they've got a way of calculating it based on a sort of standardized monster. This would be the set of things that a standardized monster would have. This AC, this sort of DC for the stuff that it can do, and so on. And it's a lot easier to say, here's my idea, now let's filter it back through the calculation and see what it is, rather than to look forward with all of those changing factors. And that's why you've got an ugly spreadsheet, and so do lots and lots of other 5th edition D&D DMs have the same ugly spreadsheet.
Right. Yeah, whether you're writing or translating or just running, you're probably at some point create such a beast, because at some point you want to see, is this encounter, is this the deadly encounter for the day, or is this just a little walkover thing that they can, a speed bump.
Yeah, and speed bumps are important, but you do want to know that it's a speed bump.
right, exactly. Yeah, because if you plan, if you're like, well, I'm all set for the afternoon, we're gonna have a 3-hour combat and have a beer, and I'm all set, and it takes them 20 minutes. That's a problem.
Yeah, because that's a lot more beers than you were planning on drinking. All right, Edwin, we're gonna probably get together again sometime soon, because
cool.
you've got lots and lots of different skills that are out there, and I want to pick your brain on some of the other stuff too. But we're probably reaching the optimal time frame on the one interview. So let's. Is there anything else that you think is a major thing for people to know, or a major piece of advice for people who want to do conversions? What advice would you give if people are doing it on the fly, or any piece of any kernels of wisdom, if you've got any left?
I mean, I think the most important thing is knowing your end rule set or language fairly well. If you're doing it on the fly, then I think it's most important to know the spirit of the system. So in other words, the spirit of Zero Edition system effectively is a D6 and a D20, and figure something out. The spirit of 5th edition, I feel like, is in advantage disadvantage with the D20. And as you were talking about the different types of damage and the different types of effects that can happen to a person, and I think sort of knowing those makes the ability to either translate or just create on the fly pretty good, and you can fake your table pretty well just by having those ideas of the spirit. I think if you're actually doing a translation for publication or for publication, then I think you really do want to know the rules in detail as opposed to just the spirit of the rules, and you want to know the language. I think language is really important, and I think the specificity of the language as used, one of the things that has happened in, I think, all gaming, he says cautiously, knowing that people will write hate mail, is that authors have realized that language is important. So in 1st edition, it's all over the place. You can have the same word meaning 3 different things, and you can have 3 different words meaning the same thing, and we're just supposed to figure it out.
Which I like that, but you're right. It's not done anymore.
Right. But it's not done.
We've lost the ability to write intricate, rich language about something when a sorcerer means something different than a wizard means something different than a warlock. So
right. So the intricacy or the excitement comes in because I've said sorcerer. That should give you a bunch of flavor. Whereas if I said warlock, whereas in 1st edition I could say warlock and sorcerer, and they all mean kind of the same thing. And so there's different types of intricacy, different types of depth, I think.
It is. There's a shorthand involved that gives lets you, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. So is a term of art like sorcerer, as opposed to word. You get a big bash of information about it just with that one word. So, I mean, I know. I just hate losing the ability to.
I'm with you. You want to be able to talk about necromancers and sorcerers in a story descriptive kind of way, because that's what authors do. And then we have to sort of, and that's actually one of the struggles I have with some of the translation stuff is oh, this is a magic word. I'm not allowed. I can't. I know the author likes this word for this thing, but boy, when the 5e people read this, they're gonna take that word and they're gonna think it means.
Which puts you into the situation of, God damn it, Finch, because I can write that way. I know that unless I'm writing with the translation in mind, I'm going to be way off the reservation that way.
Yeah. So I think knowing those keywords. I mean, I keep a OneNote document of. I mean, obviously I keep the 5e books handy or the Swords and Wizardry books handy, whatever it is. But I also have just a 5e note page that reminds me of whether is it lightly obscured or partially obscured. I know there's only one of the two, but which one is it?
Right.
What is the language that implies that you have partial cover or full color? Is it 3/4 cover or half cover? Okay, one of those is Pathfinder, and one, so I have all of those sort of keywords listed out for me, so that when I'm doing the translation, I don't screw up and accidentally use the wrong magic phrase.
Right.
And then I can write sentences that feel fluid, hopefully, but that have those keywords in them.
Yeah, and there is a fair amount of writing actual text when you're doing conversions too, because something like the description of a trap, you're actually going to have to go in, and redo a trap description in some of those things where you're taking language out and putting it in. So.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, everybody. So sorry, go ahead.
I was going to do that. I was going to say that's it.
Okay. So that in summary, I think this has been a really, really interesting interview on the topic of the artistry that goes into a deep conversion of one system to the other, and it probably applies to several systems other than just what we were talking about, which was older editions of D&D going to 5th edition D&D. And so, thank you very much, Edwin, for being on the show. This is a great interview.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right, so I will go ahead and give my normal sign-off thing of everybody, whatever kind of Dungeons and Dragons it is that you play, imagine the hell out of it.